Military log, 19th of November 1942, 05:30 hours, southwestern front near Kalach-on-Don, USSR. Temperature, 22nd C. Visibility, 800 meters. Wind, 14 km/h from northwest. It was the kind of cold that made steel groan and the breath of men freeze before it left their lips. In the early pre-dawn darkness, Lieutenant Karl Weiss of the 14th Panzer Division rubbed the frost from his binoculars, peering into a ghostly white horizon beyond the Don River. Behind him, the faint outline of German half-tracks idled with muted engines, their exhaust forming low clouds over the snow. A voice crackled over the radio, muffled, confident, dismissive. "Another Soviet diversion. Nothing more," said General Hermann Hoth from his field headquarters, his tone heavy with certainty. For weeks, reports had filtered in of Soviet tank buildups north of the Don, of strange radio silence in entire sectors, of peasants disappearing from villages near the front. Each warning had been waved away by staff officers with a smirk. Russian theatrics, they said. The Red Army had been battered, broken and predictable, or so the Wehrmacht believed. But beneath the ice, under the cover of night and deception, the Soviet juggernaut was waking. Across the steppe, hidden in fog and snow, hundreds of T-34s crouched in silence, engines off, crews wrapped in greatcoats, breath clouding inside the turrets. They waited for one word. Nachal, the order to begin. The voiceover deepens. In the frozen silence before dawn, arrogance was about to meet annihilation. Near Gumruk Airfield, a young Soviet tank commander, Senior Lieutenant Ivan Petrov of the 26th Tank Corps, sat in his vehicle, his hands trembling slightly on the control levers. He had been told by his political officer that this attack would change the war. His brother had died 3 months earlier in the ruins of Stalingrad, cut down by German MG-42 fire as he tried to carry ammunition to a rifle platoon. Ivan had sworn revenge, not in words but in silence, a promise made before the shattered walls of his brother's last position. When the red flare finally hissed into the sky, he broke protocol. Instead of waiting for command timing, he slammed the throttle forward, yelling to his crew, "Za Stalingrad!" The T-34 roared to life, tracks biting the frozen earth, followed by dozens of others. Across a 30-kilometer front, the steppe erupted. The first artillery salvo screamed overhead, 3,500 Soviet guns, mortars, and Katyusha launchers firing simultaneously in the greatest bombardment the Eastern Front had seen. The German positions disintegrated under the storm. Snow turned to mud and blood. Observation bunkers vanished in flame. Radio lines snapped, field telephones went dead, and entire companies of Romanian infantry, stretched thin along the flanks, were erased before they could fire a shot. Lieutenant Weiss clutched his helmet as the earth heaved beneath him. "What in God's name?" he started, but the rest was drowned by the concussion of shells. He saw figures running, not toward the front, but away. Romanians terrified, abandoning their trenches. A Feldwebel tried to stop them, pistol raised, but was trampled under the stampede. Weiss turned to his driver. "Get the panzer moving now." In the chaos, radio reports poured into German headquarters. Soviet armor breakthrough north of Kletskaya. 200 tanks sighted, no resistance. Another voice. South of the Don, enemy armor in force. Request reinforcements. The generals still refused to believe. "Impossible," said General Schmidt, Paulus's chief of staff. "They have no reserves left." But within hours, over 300 Soviet tanks from General Romanenko IS and General Vatutin OS fronts were advancing in a pincer movement that no one in the 6th Army fully understood until it was too late. Petrov's T-34s tore through snow and smoke, cutting through Romanian artillery lines like paper. German forward observers reported seeing black crosses swallowed by red storms. The Soviets moved fast, each T-34 accompanied by infantry clinging to the hulls, shouting through the din, their submachine guns ready for the trenches ahead. The German Pak-36 anti-tank guns, effective 2 years earlier, were useless now. Rounds bounced off the T-34's sloped armor with hollow clangs. One gun crew fired until the barrel glowed, then tried to run. Petrov's gunner caught them in his sights and fired. The shell hit directly. Snow and men vanished in an instant. The Red Army had learned, adapted, and evolved, no longer the chaotic mass that bled itself dry in 1941. This was something new, coordinated, disciplined, relentless. On the German side, disbelief turned to panic. Radio logs from the day read like fragments of a nightmare. All communications lost with 3rd Romanian Army, enemy armor at rear positions, heavy casualties, situation untenable. By 10 hours, Weiss's battalion was in retreat, falling back toward Kalach. He looked to the horizon and saw smoke columns rising. Dozens, then hundreds. "It's not a diversion," he muttered. His voice trembled, not from cold, but from understanding. Over the radio, an officer shouted, "Hold your ground, you are the shield of the Reich." But Weiss could hear the desperation. He switched channels. Silence. Then another. Screams. Static. And a single phrase repeated. "Panzer umzingelt. Umzingelt." Tanks surrounded. Petrov's corps had achieved breakthrough. By nightfall, the two Soviet pincers, north and south of Stalingrad, were racing toward each other across the steppe. Their goal was not mere victory, it was encirclement. Stalin himself had demanded it. The codename was Operation Uranus, and it was about to become the greatest reversal in modern military history. Inside Stalingrad, General Paulus S. 6th Army, the over 250,000 men, remained fixated on the last Soviet pockets near the Volga, unaware that the ground beneath them was about to close like a steel trap. The voiceover shifts. Hubris is the first casualty of war. The German generals had mocked the Red Army as clumsy peasants in steel coffins. Now those coffins were coming for them. South of the Don, in a snow-choked ravine, Weiss' Panzer IV skidded on the ice as it tried to reverse through the burning wreckage of supply trucks. A wounded soldier stumbled out of the smoke, his coat ablaze, screaming for his mother. Weiss leapt from the turret, ignoring orders to stay inside. He wrapped the man in his own winter cloak, dousing the flames with snow. The soldier's skin peeled away under his touch. Weiss froze. He knew the man. Private Hans Keller, his radio operator from Poland, reassigned weeks earlier to an infantry detachment. The young man's eyes locked onto his. "They said Soviets were finished," Keller gasped. "They lied." Then he went still. Weiss stared at him for a long moment, his breath ragged, before slamming his fist into the frozen ground. That act, leaving the tank, exposing himself, was a violation of protocol. But in that moment, no code mattered. Above him, the roar of engines grew louder. Dozens of T-34s crested the ridge. Their silhouettes appeared black against the orange sky. Weiss ran for his panzer, shouting to his crew, "Engage! Engage now!" The first shells struck within seconds. Dirt and ice flew like shrapnel. He aimed, fired, and watched one T-34 burst into flame. But for every one destroyed, 5 more appeared. Soviet infantry swarmed the flanks, firing submachine guns and throwing grenades. The German line disintegrated. Weiss ordered a retreat, not to save himself, but to warn command. He needed to tell them what was coming. But the radio net was gone. Static filled the air. The German 6th Army, once the most formidable on the Eastern Front, was now blind, deaf, and encircled. On the morning of November 22nd, Soviet spearheads from the North and South fronts met near the town of Kalach, closing the ring. The trap was complete. 300,000 Axis troops were inside. Outside, Petrov's tank stood amid the wreckage of burned German columns, his crew exhausted but silent. He looked east, towards Stalingrad, where his brother had fallen, and whispered through the static of his radio, "Comrade, brother, we did it." Snow began to fall again, gently, as if to cover the dead. The voiceover fades in. The German High Command had mocked Soviet tactics, laughed at their crude machines, dismissed their human waves. But in the frozen wasteland of Stalingrad, the Red Army rewrote the rules of war, and from that day on the hunters became the hunted. The snow kept falling through the night, soft at first, then thick, muting the screams, covering the corpses, burying the evidence of arrogance beneath a white shroud. Within the encirclement, confusion reigned. German field radios flickered in and out with dying batteries. Operators huddled in torn tents, their fingers numb, their faces gray with frostbite and disbelief. "The Russians cannot hold this line," a colonel insisted inside a commandeered farmhouse that served as a regimental HQ, his words trembling between conviction and denial. "This is temporary. They'll break themselves against our defenses." But no one responded. Around the room, staff officers stared into the map, seeing nothing but red arrows closing from all directions. The truth was undeniable. The 6th Army was surrounded, and the rescue that would never come was still just a whisper of promise from Führer headquarters hundreds of kilometers away. Outside, Lieutenant Karl Weiss moved with his crew among wrecked vehicles, searching for ammunition, fuel, anything that could keep them moving. The tank's engine had frozen solid overnight, oil thickened like tar. "We can't stay," said his gunner, Schmidt, teeth chattering. "We'll freeze before we fight." Weiss nodded, but said nothing. His eyes followed a column of Soviet searchlights sweeping the horizon. Somewhere beyond that glare, hundreds of T-34s prowled, engines idling, waiting for dawn. He thought of the phrase the generals used to mock the Soviets: they throw bodies, not tactics. Yet what he saw now was precision. Mechanized flanking maneuvers, coordinated artillery grids, communication between armor and infantry the Germans once claimed only they could master. The Soviets had become a mirror of everything the Wehrmacht once was, only colder, hungrier, and angrier. Far to the north, Ivan Petrov's tank column rolled through the shattered remains of Kalach, where the bridge across the Don still smoldered from Luftwaffe strikes. A Soviet engineer detachment was already laying pontoon bridges under fire. The air smelled of cordite and diesel. Petrov leaned out of his turret, his scarf crusted with ice, watching German prisoners shuffle past, hundreds of them hollow-eyed, their hands raised, some still wearing medals from France and Poland. He felt nothing. The victory, though immense, was not triumph. It was vengeance, slow, cold, exacting. His radio crackled. All armored units hold positions east of the Don, await coordination with 5th Tank Army. Priority, seal the pocket. He acknowledged, but hesitated. His commander had warned them that trapped Germans were most dangerous when cornered. But he also knew that if the ring was not tightened immediately, Paulus's army might still slip through. He made a decision. "We advance without delay," he ordered. His political officer protested, "Comrade, those are not our orders." Petrov stared ahead, eyes burning under the frost. "My brother's orders are stronger." The T-34s roared forward again. Inside the pocket, General Paulus remained calm. Too calm. His adjutant later recalled that Paulus's hands never stopped moving, rearranging papers, repositioning maps, cleaning his glasses as though tidiness could restore order to chaos. Reports arrived hourly, ammunition low, fuel almost gone, rations for 3 days. Still, the order from Hitler was explicit: hold Stalingrad, do not break out. Paulus's reply was obedience, fatal obedience. He believed that the Luftwaffe could resupply them, as Göring promised. The generals around him nodded mechanically, knowing it was impossible. The airfields were within range of Soviet guns. The weather made flying suicidal. But no one dared contradict the Führer's will. The voiceover enters deep and cold. Discipline without reason becomes death in uniform. By November 25th, the Soviet noose had shrunk to a ring 50 kilometers across. The Germans called it Der Kessel, the cauldron. Thousands of men dug into frozen trenches, built bunkers from wrecked vehicles, and waited for rescue. The Soviets called it the rat trap. Ivan Petrov's unit now patrolled the outer ring, intercepting any attempted breakout. One night, during a blizzard, his crew spotted movement, figures dragging a wounded comrade across the snow. Through his binoculars, Petrov saw they were Germans, 6 of them carrying a man missing both legs. His loader muttered, "Orders are to fire on all who move." Petrov hesitated. Through the snow, one of the Germans raised his arm, not in surrender but in salute, the old military gesture of respect to an enemy. Petrov felt something twist in his chest. He lowered the gun. "Let them go," he said quietly. His political officer glared. "That's disobedience." Petrov didn't answer. He just watched as the Germans disappeared into the blizzard, their tracks quickly swallowed by snow. Even in vengeance, he realized humanity survived. Barely. Meanwhile, Weiss's tank crew had fallen back toward the ruins of Marinovka, part of a desperate defensive perimeter. They had gone 3 days without food. Fuel was rationed by the Leder, ammunition by the shell. Each panzer that broke down was stripped for parts and burned to keep warm. The once proud 14th Panzer Division was now a handful of frozen machines scattered across the steppe. In one exchange, they managed to ambush a Soviet patrol at dawn, destroying 2 T-34s before being surrounded again. Weiss watched his driver, Schultz, climb out to reattach a thrown track. Then a sniper's bullet cracked. Schultz dropped instantly, blood spreading across the snow like spilled ink. Weiss froze, heart pounding, unable to move. He had given the order that exposed the man. The guilt struck harder than the cold. He slammed his hand against the hatch, shouting at no one. For a moment, he considered turning the gun on himself, but then another explosion, close, deafening, snapped him back. Duty replaced despair. "Reload! Fire!" he shouted. The tank's 75mm gun boomed again, echoing through the white plains. Back in Moscow, the Stavka command center glowed with lamplight as maps shifted hourly. Generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky stood over a massive chart showing the German 6th Army encircled like a trapped beast. "We close the gap tighter," Zhukov said, his voice cold as iron. "Every kilometer we reduce means fewer that escape." Stalin, smoking in silence, simply nodded. "No negotiation," he said. "They will freeze, starve, or surrender. But not one will leave." Orders went out to every front. No mercy, no pause. The T-34s were refueled, crews rotated, guns cleaned. The Red Army was no longer the desperate defender of 1941. It was the predator now, and the steppe was its hunting ground. In the pocket, the situation turned from bad to biblical. Horses were slaughtered for food. Frozen corpses were stacked to block wind. Men cut buttons from their coats to barter for bread. Frostbite turned fingers black. Disease spread. "We are eating the dead," one soldier wrote in his diary, discovered decades later in the ruins of Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe tried to drop supplies, but most parachutes drifted into Soviet hands. Of 500 tons promised daily, only 100 ever reached the trapped army. Weiss and his crew shared a single tin of beans between 4 men, heating it over the muzzle of their gun. He looked at their faces, hollow, gaunt, ghost-like, and wondered how they had gone from conquerors to the condemned in mere months. He thought of Berlin, of parades, of laughter. Now there was only silence and snow. December came with no relief. The Soviets unleashed Operation Little Saturn to widen the encirclement, crushing Italian and Hungarian divisions along the flanks. More T-34s poured in, sleek, unstoppable, their engines never resting. Weiss's unit was pushed back again, retreating yard by yard. One night, as the blizzard howled, a desperate message reached all German units. Relief coming from the west. Army Group Dawn advancing. It was General Manstein's Operation Winter Storm. Hope flickered like a dying candle. Weiss held onto it with shaking hands. Maybe, just maybe, they would survive. On December 20th, Soviet spotters reported a large armoured force moving toward the encirclement from Kotelnikovo. Petrov's corps was ordered to intercept. They moved south at full speed, engines roaring through the night, treads clattering like thunder across the ice. At dawn, near Verkhneykumsky, the two forces met. German Tigers against Soviet T-34s in a brutal close-range engagement. Shells collided at 500 meters, tanks burning on both sides. Petrov's T-34 took a hit that cracked the armor but didn't penetrate. His gunner returned fire, scoring a direct hit on a Tiger's turret ring. The explosion lifted the turret clean off. The Germans fought hard, but the Soviets had numbers and momentum. Within 48 hours, the relief attempt failed. The ring around Stalingrad held. Inside the pocket, the radio message that reached Weiss was a whisper through static. "No breakout. You are on your own." By Christmas, the encircled army was collapsing. Men wandered in delirium, calling for mothers long dead. Priests held services in burned-out churches, their voices trembling under bombardment. Weiss's crew huddled in their tank, now more shelter than weapon. "Will we die here, Herr Leutnant?" Schmidt asked. Weiss didn't answer. Instead, he took out Keller AES identification tag, the boy who had burned in his arms weeks earlier, and clenched it tight. "He already did," he murmured. "We're just waiting our turn." Above them, Soviet artillery fired without pause, day and night, until the horizon became a continuous flash. Ivan Petrov received new orders: move into the inner ring. The final reduction of the pocket had begun. As his tank advanced through the snow, he saw the devastation. Entire German battalions surrendering, officers weeping, wagons filled with frozen corpses stacked like logs. He felt no joy, only exhaustion. War had aged him years and months. At one point, his T-34 rolled over a frozen trench where German soldiers had died, clutching each other for warmth. He closed his eyes. They were human too, he thought. But he didn't stop. The order was clear. Advance. January 1943. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees. The Germans had no more strength. Weiss's tank was out of fuel. They burned maps to stay warm. He looked at his men, hollow shadows, and finally made a decision that went against everything he had been taught. "We surrender," he said quietly. Schmidt stared, stunned. "To Russians?" Weiss nodded. "To life." They fashioned a white flag from a shirt and climbed out into the snow. A group of Soviet soldiers approached cautiously, rifles raised. One of them, face hidden under frost, lowered his weapon first. It was Petrov. For a long moment, the two men just stared at each other, enemies bound by exhaustion, by loss, by survival. Weiss extended his hand. Petrov hesitated, then took it. No words, just a silent acknowledgement of the futility that had consumed millions. The voiceover returns, calm yet haunting. In Stalingrad, the German generals learned what mockery costs. The Red Army they scorned had become the instrument of their destruction. 300 T-34s had closed the trap, and with them history turned. The steppe kept its silence, but the echoes of arrogance still lingered.